Hello, we are live. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I am a licensed therapist, technically a LCPC, licensed clinical professional counselor in the state of Illinois. But this is not therapy for so very many reasons. What this is just an open conversation. It's me streaming for an hour a week because it's a way for us to be able to connect and chat with each other, talk about things. I am very privileged to have the opportunity to spend a lot of my resources, a lot of time and energy thinking about and learning about and working with issues of neurodiversity in particular and executive functioning, but just things that generally would fall into the category of cognitive, social, mental, emotional issues. And not everybody has that opportunity. So this is a way for me to be accessible, for us to be able to have this conversation about those kinds of things. Every week we pick a topic, and this week, I guess I should have mentioned off the top, our regular host, Marie Moran, is not going to be here today, unfortunately. We'll miss her, but she did wonderful work in setting up a topic for us and even kind of soliciting some questions. So we have some things to talk about off the top. But as always, those of you who are here watching this live, I've got the chat up and open. So if anyone is chatting, putting anything in the chat, any questions, comments, whatever, the things that I'm saying and doing will impact you. The things that you say and do will impact me. That's how a conversation works. And if that takes us outside of the established topic for today, then that's where we go. I run a small practice called Effective AuDHD. It's a small private group therapy practice. Group meaning we have a group of clinicians, not that we only do group therapy work. We do primarily individual, but also couples, family, and at the moment no group, although we're heading towards launching some group work. We are able to practice with anyone in the state of Illinois. And we practice a neurodiversity affirming approach. That's, again, one of the things that I have the privilege to be able to do is to kind of think and learn and develop something that not everyone has the chance to do. So that's the way we approach it. Unfortunately, at the moment, we are on a wait list. I'm working to rectify that. We're in the process of hiring. If anybody out there is a licensed therapist in the state of Illinois interested in this work, hit me up. admin@effectiveartistry.com. But we'll probably be having some new people join our practice soon. We've met with some great candidates. As part of that, we have construction going on the other side of the wall behind the camera, which I guess I should ask. I hope everyone can hear me okay. If anyone is here and cannot hear me, please let me know. I think I've got the audio set up correctly. We also do executive functioning coaching, although we don't have as much capacity on that as we once did. We've kind of been more focused on expanding the therapy side of things lately. But Marie, who regularly hosts this, is one of our wonderful coaches. What else? I apologize for not being here last week, especially for the late notice. It was my son's 4th birthday, so we took him out to a special lunch, just he and his mother and I and his baby brother, but his older brother was at school, which was nice. And I just been very busy lately, and it had slipped my mind repeatedly to notify Marie, to be able to notify everyone that we were canceling. So I apologize for the late notice, but we're here today. I don't remember everything that I was saying before, but we're here. We're going to chat. And it's just me, which it hasn't been just me in a while. I always prefer to have somebody else to talk to, but happy to be here in any way that I can. I'm pulling out my phone because Marie chose a topic and set up some questions and messaged it all to me on my phone. So I'm going to be referencing that until and unless I'm seeing things in the chat that take us elsewhere. The theme for today is when autism meets ADHD. Oh, fun. And apparently there has been some discussion online, on Twitter especially, about the AuDHD portmanteau, AuDHD. It's a label that some people who identify as being both autistic and having ADHD have used to identify themselves, and apparently there's some pushback on that. So Marie put out some questions on Twitter. Number one, in what situations do you feel like your autistic and ADHD traits clash? Number two, in what situations do you find them helpful? Have you identified strengths that you associate with being AuDHD? The responses shared a common theme. People feel like the part of them they associate with ADHD is spontaneous, eager to try new things, hungry for change. Sorry, I got distracted. There was something in the chat, but it's just a spam. Hey, buddy, if you're here, spam bot, please let me know if you can hear me. I'm worried that I've got my sound settings on wrong. People feel like the part of them they associate with ADHD is spontaneous, eager to try new things, hungry for change, but the part they associate with autism craves order, structure, and routine. There was some discussion of sensory overload too. Some questions or thoughts that might arise from this. One, my ADHD hyperfocus keeps me engaged for hours, but I can sometimes forget to attend to basic needs like eating or going to the bathroom, and I end up feeling burned out. How can I address this? Should I do this one at a time? Let's see. No, I'm going to read through this all and we can kind of jump around. I'll come back to the structure, but there are things I might reference. I just did a quick scan to the bottom there. Two, I love going on holiday or vacation and visiting new places, but I feel like I need a strict schedule and itinerary and get stressed when we deviate from this. This creates conflict with my partner, who's very spontaneous. How can my partner and I make holidays less stressful for both of us? Three, my ADHD means I get bored quickly and I want to do 10 things at once. I love multitasking. However, my autistic side wants to do one thing at a time, undisturbed, and hates interruptions. Language. Some autistic people feel that in adopting the portmanteau AuDHD, people who are both ADHD and autistic are doing the autistic community a disservice. They feel like adding the D for disorder back into any discussion of autism is harmful, as it stigmatizes autistic people as inherently disordered. What's my take on this and on the language we use around neurodiversity in general? And some others, if autism and ADHD are two ends of a spectrum in most people's conceptualization of neurodiversity, then how can someone be both? Does this mean there's an implication that it's no longer a spectrum? And if so, what is it? Two, this was from one of our clinicians. Some of my clients feel trepidation identifying with both because they worry that they will invalidate people who identify as one or the other. And three, people can feel uncomfortable with this because it sort of detangles the pathological model. That's a lot. I like it. And we'll come back to it, but we'll start with just a broad discussion. Autism and ADHD are both poorly named. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's no such thing as an attention deficit. There's not even an argument to be made about what we would measure to say that someone has less attention. We could potentially say that a person has a diminished ability to focus their attention or consciously control the direction their attention is going. But even that, I mean, I would take issue with that personally because attention is allocated through non-conscious processes. It's called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And by the way, there's impulsive hyperactive presentation and inattentive presentation and combined presentation. But why they would call it attention deficit hyperactivity disorder when one of the presentations of it has nothing to do with hyperactivity by its own definition, it's very interesting. There's a history there, but I don't know how much it matters. It's called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder because those are the things that people outside of the person themselves are likely to notice and be bothered by and how they might conceptualize it. So most people, until very recently, and probably still most people who are diagnosed with ADHD are diagnosed as children. It was only fairly recently that many people even started thinking that it was a thing that adults could even have. It used to be kind of, it wasn't official, but it was, well, I should say different ways of looking at this in different parts of the world. From my understanding, I believe in the UK, the national, I'm blanking on the name. What is it called? The National Health Service, NHS, is that right? Didn't even do a diagnostic process for ADHD or autism, I believe, for people over the age of 18 until something like the last 7 or 8 years. but it was culturally considered, even if it wasn't always officially considered, to be a thing that kids do, kids have, right? It's a kid's thing. To this day, they still both require that they're, for an official diagnosis, that traits and things that that are relevant to the diagnostic criteria must have appeared as a child, specifically before the age of 3. Anyway, what that means is most people who were getting diagnosed with ADHD were people who were struggling to follow the classroom rules, potentially being disruptive or struggling in class. And as an adult, as a teacher or a parent, or someone from the outside who is attempting to get a child to focus, pay attention on a particular thing, and they're struggling and they're unable to do that, then when we're going to pathologize that and turn that into a diagnosis, it makes a lot of sense to say that they have a problem with their attention, as opposed to they pay attention to different things, or they pay attention to things in different amounts or whatever, because everyone's approaching it from, this is what you're supposed to pay attention to. If you're not paying attention and you're not paying as much attention or for as long as you're supposed to, then there must be something wrong. It must be a deficit. But that's not how it is. And of course, like we just said, hyperactivity is in the name, even though the diagnosis itself has an entire category of people who are explicitly, per the diagnoses, like definition, not exhibiting hyperactive symptoms. People have explored, putting forward different terms for this, but we might get to that in a little bit. Autism, I think, is less commonly discussed in terms of like the etymology of the name. I know for myself, it wasn't something I thought of until, I don't know, sometime in the last few years, somebody pointed out autism, AUT-ism, same root as automobile, autobiography. It means self. So autism, in the etymology of the word, means a person who is by themselves, a person who is isolated or in their own space. I know that I can't speak to the veracity of this. This is something I've seen online, this next thing, but I've heard that the Maori term for it translates to a person in their own space and time. Yeah, okay, we'll leave that there. Now, autism spectrum disorder is that's the official diagnostic label. If a person is officially diagnosed as autistic, they're diagnosed as having autism spectrum disorder. Prior to the release of the DSM-5, the 5th edition, before that was the DSM-4, that was in 2013, so 10 years now. Wow, it feels more recent than that. Prior to that was Asperger's. Asperger's syndrome was its own category. Pervasive developmental delay was its own category. I have to refresh myself. It's been so long. Nonverbal learning disorder. I don't remember what other ones were officially rolled under in the DSM-5, what is just called autism spectrum disorder. So in the official language, it has the word disorder associated with it. Now, I would agree that disorder is inexact at best. It's useful. It's a useful label. Well, we have to talk about this. Okay. So disorder, as opposed to disease and as opposed to syndrome, these are 3 different categories of things. They're not just interchangeable words. And for the most part, people know, for example, no one would call it like Down's disease, right? Everyone knows to say Down syndrome as opposed to Down's disease or Down's disorder, both of which would sound very, incorrect, just rolling off the tongue. We'd identify it right away as being incorrect. But generally, people don't know why some things are called disorders, why some are called syndromes, and why some are called diseases. So let's talk about that for a quick second here. Because autism, now this is a technical thing. We're going to talk about how language, how people interpret things and connotations and denotations and stigma and all that. We'll get into how things are used, but we're going to start with technical definitions. And what I would say is, even those people who identify applying the word disorder to the experience of being an autistic person, even the people who disagree or dislike that would still probably agree that by the technical definition, autism is a disorder. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want to look at changing the language. We're just talking about technically. So a disease is something that's called a disease is something that we can, A, it's pathological, B, the pathophysiology of it, meaning the biological mechanism by which the disease happens, is observable. The kind of like, I don't know if this is totally accurate, but the more pithy way I've heard that phrased is a disease needs to be observable even on the autopsy table, meaning even in a corpse, we should be able to see the mechanism of the disease. And this is a big deal because disorders are not diseases, categorically are not diseases. They are a completely separate category of thing. And everyone's conflating the two, conflating meaning, thinking that two things are the same when they're actually distinct. Everyone's conflating the two, not everyone, but most people are conflating the two, and it causes a lot of problems because here's what happens with a disease. With a disease, the first way that I might have some idea, some inkling that I might have a disease is that I experience a symptom. Something happens that is painful, uncomfortable, unusual in some way, right? I faint, I am vomiting, I'm sweaty, whatever, coughing, any of the symptoms that you all know. Then I'm going to either myself with support or whatever, but theoretically, if I go to a professional, I go to a medical doctor and tell them about my symptoms, they come up with an idea of what they think might be going on. So they match those symptoms against the known symptomatic presentation of various diseases and isolate, which one do they think, oh. So let's use diabetes as an example. If I am, urinating frequently and getting some tingling sense in my feet, and also my breath smells very sweet, and I go to the doctor and tell them all that, then they're probably going to say, they might ask some questions and ask about my diet and sugar and whatever, but they'll probably say, okay, this sounds like diabetes. Because those symptoms put together, the most common reason for those things is diabetes. Then they order a test. And then we go and take the test, in the case of diabetes, usually a blood draw, and they look and they count the insulin level and the blood sugar level in the blood. I think actually they start with, well, whatever, doesn't matter. We don't need to be super accurate about diabetes, but basically we take some blood and we look at the blood and we can observe and count the amount of insulin, we'll say, per million, right? Parts per million in the blood. If it is abnormally low, and we can look at a range, normal presentation is from such to such, right? And if it's significantly lower than that, then we can say, yep, this is diabetes. And then we start treating it. Now, if we go and take that test and they look and they say, nope, insulin looks good, it's not diabetes, then we go back and say, okay, what other explanation could there be then, maybe that's less common for these three things? The frequent urination, tingling in the feet, and the sweet smelling breath. Maybe there's something else going on. Maybe there are multiple things going on, and these are actually symptoms of different things that are just presenting in this way. And we run another test, and we run another test until we find something that we can confirm. And if we run enough tests and we can't find anything that we can confirm and say we know exactly what is happening here, then, well, some people might just dismiss it out of hand and say, oh, it's psychosomatic, which does not mean what people think that it means, or whatever, and just throw it away. Hopefully, most responsible, educated, like conscientious people, especially doctors, would say, okay, well, we have no explanation for why you're experiencing these symptoms. So the best we can do is focus on symptom management. And we'll continue to keep an eye on things. And as new data comes to light, maybe that'll help us refine or look for different things. But in the meantime, we just focus on symptom management, making it as comfortable as possible for you, right? And so you wouldn't be diagnosed with anything. That's a disease. You experience the symptoms. We make our guesses about what those symptoms are coming from, the disease, and then we run an objective, observable test to be able to confirm the presence of that disease or deny the presence of that disease. Syndrome is a little bit different. Syndrome is where we can look at something like Down syndrome, for example. Really, a lot of genetic disorders are going to fall under this category of syndrome, but there's a lot of other things as well. The syndrome is where we see a collection of symptoms present co-occurring in large numbers or some kind of pattern, right? We see, well, this person has this abnormal symptom and this and this and this, so there's 12 of them. And this other person has the exact same 12, and this other person has those same 12. And this, so at a certain point we say, okay, clearly something's going on, or at least it seems like that these 12 symptoms are related to something. But we look and we look and we come up with theories and we explore and we can't find the pathophysiology. That's the jargony term for the specific observable thing that is happening in the biology that results in the symptom. We can't figure out what that is. That's when we call it a syndrome. Now, a lot of things like Down syndrome, we have a lot of genetic disorders that we put in the category of syndrome. The distinction here is that we can look and say, like in the case of Down syndrome, we can say definitively everyone who has Down syndrome has this extra chromosome. And if a person has this extra chromosome, they have Down syndrome. So we can say what is happening there. We know, or not what is happening. We can say very confidently that people with this extra gene have these symptoms. We still can't look and say what exactly the mechanism of that is. We don't know exactly what it is about having that extra gene. In what particular way does that affect cells or chemicals or whatever that then results in the symptomatic expression. We have theories about it, and of course, a lot of research around these things is aimed at trying to find what is the biological mechanism so that we can target that, so that if somebody does have some problematic symptom from a disorder or from a syndrome, I'm getting all these words confused. That's not going to make it easier for anybody. That we can look at symptom management or even relief or reversal or whatever. So as an example, my oldest son has what's called congenital hypothyroidism. His body does not produce thyroid hormone in any amount. Either he, for whatever reason, his body just did not develop a thyroid gland, or if it's there, it just doesn't work, or it might be in the wrong place is a common thing, you know. In the past, the symptoms that result from that particular disease are, you know, intellectual developmental delay, intellectual disability, facial malformations, all kinds of things. I mean, it's a very severe, it really affects people over the span of their lives. It's very, very high impact thing. Now, these days, it's part of, at least in Illinois, and I would hope and imagine most states, it's part of the screening that they do with all newborns. Every newborn, they take some blood and they check for just a bunch of things just to be on the safe side. This in particular, congenital hypothyroidism, is 1 in 4,000, I think. So very rare, but they check it because if they find it, all you have to do at this point with modern medicine, thank goodness, is he takes his thyroid, he gets his thyroid hormone in the form of a pill. Every day of his life since he was a baby, he takes a pill. He has to get his blood drawn at regular intervals to see how the levels are looking and whether they need to adjust the dosage up or down. And so that eliminates those symptoms. So a lot of medical research around different syndromes is looking for stuff like that. If we can see like the start point and we can see the observable symptom, if we can find what the mechanism is in between, we can try and potentially develop some intervention to try and negate or reverse or mitigate some of those problems. And I want to be clear that this is, again, pathological, meaning, maybe I should have explained that. Pathological, shorthand just means injury or illness. It means a thing is not as it should be. So this is, when we're going to get to disorders here in a minute, this is a whole different ballgame. But when we're talking about physicality, for example, we can say there are some things which observably and experientially vary without it being identifiably globally worse to be that way, right? Being taller or shorter, or having different color hair, eyes, skin, there's no global inherent biological advantage or disadvantage to different versions of that. Whereas some things don't vary from human to human, except in cases of injury or illness. For example, all humans have 2 eyes and use binocular vision. If that is not the case, then we would say that's either from an injury or an illness. We would call that pathological. So some things are relatively static across the human species, with rare exceptions, and those exceptions seem to be in some global way negative. Meaning, doesn't mean that there's no upside, no advantage to it, but on balance. Effectively think of it as if you had the option, would anyone theoretically, hypothetically choose the pathological version? And we would generally, if we're calling it pathological, we would generally say no, no one would choose that. Even though there are strengths and benefits and differences that are advantageous both to the individual and to the community that individual is a part of. Kind of like saying, when you suffer, when you go through adversity, you can say, yeah, I learned, I grew, I became stronger, I changed. If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have blanked. We can talk about the good things that happen, but still suffering, adversity is not a thing that we desire for people to have to go through. When it happens, there are benefits to it, but we'd still avoid it if we could. So that's disease and syndrome. Disease, we have to know, we have to be able to observe what is happening. Syndrome, we have to be able to observe the symptoms happening in conjunction with each other, but not necessarily know exactly why it's happening. Disorder is a third different category, and disorder means disordered, meaning not ordered. So first, in order to be able to call anything a disorder, first we have to identify what we would consider to be the orderly or the ordered version of it. So in the case of what most people would call mental health or neurodevelopmental disorders, basically everything in the DSM, anything depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, personality disorder, anything with disorder on the end of it. In order for us to call something like that a disorder, first we have to look at what we would consider to be the ordered version. And in the medical model, the deficit model, which neurodiversity is a rejection of, even though a lot of people, we've talked a lot, most people who are talking about neurodiversity are still using the medical model, they're just using neurodiversity language. The medical model says, okay, we can draw a perimeter around what we would call ordered experiences and behavior. Experiences as reported by self-report, but translated by the person receiving the communication. And behavior can be observed externally, right? So those are the two things. What does the person say about their own experience? And what do other people besides the person observe about their behavior? If we can put parameters around everything we would consider this is ordered behavior, this is orderly, then anything that takes place outside of those parameters, we would say then is disordered behavior. It is a disorder. Order and disorder is culturally established. In the DSM, there are things like, for example, delayed sleep phase disorder. Am I saying that right? Delayed sleep onset? No, I think it's delayed sleep phase disorder. And the diagnostic criteria says consistently goes to bed or goes to sleep 2 or more hours after is considered culturally normal, standard. I forget the exact word, but it does use the word culture in there. It's saying basically, if everyone in a particular community is saying we all go to bed at 10 o'clock and then 1 or 2 of us are going to bed at 1 a.m. every night, well, then those people we can say have delayed sleep phase disorder. But take them from that community, put them in a different community where everyone's going to bed at 1 a.m. and we would no longer diagnose them with that disorder. Oppositional defiant disorder has as one of its diagnostic criteria that the person engages in behavior which annoys those around them, which obviously depends on who the people are around them and the ways in which they're responding to what the individual being diagnosed with ODD is doing, right? There are even things where we can all, or at least most of us can agree that they're useful to exist as diagnostic categories, even if we might debate particulars about it. Like, for example, major depressive disorder, that's generally a non-controversial disorder. People generally agree that exists. Even that still depends on what is our cultural concept of the typical, the orderly, the expected extent to which a person is experiencing sadness or depression, right? I mean, the diagnostic criteria include things like feeling sad most or all of the day, most days of the week for 6 months or longer. And I don't think it says sad. I think it says feeling I don't have all this stuff memorized off the top of my head. You can look most of this up online. You probably can't find the full, well, I mean, you can pirate anything, but I doubt you can find like the full DSM-5 in one place online for free, but you can Google the specific disorders, and usually you'll be able to find resources that list out the diagnostic criteria, like one each. So disorder in the context, I mean, in the definition of the term, disorder means that we collectively, the people who have decided that this is a disorder, have determined that there is a typical way of going about of experiencing and or behaving. And we've noticed, like in a syndrome and like with the disease, where we would still notice the symptoms first, right? We have noticed some symptoms, meaning people are experiencing things that are unusual, unpleasant, uncomfortable to some extent. And those symptoms co-occur with other symptoms at some rate that seems notable. So we start looking at it and labeling it. This is how ADHD came to be a thing. This is how autism became to be a thing. These are not like diabetes, where someone came up with a theory for the symptoms, started looking and found the pathophysiology. We just notice, okay, this person is struggling to regulate their attention as observed, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff is filtered through the people who are talking about it, right? They're moving around a lot, hyperactive. They have a hard time staying focused on what they forget things, etc. All these things which are actually diagnostic criteria in the DSM. And by the way, any of you who are aware of like Asperger's is no longer a thing. What that means is it was in the DSM when it was the 4th edition. It was taken out for the 5th edition. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, is the book which dictates what these things are and how they are officially categorized and diagnosed. If it does not exist in the DSM, it does not exist as an official disorder. That's why we say Asperger's doesn't exist. It's not a thing, right? Even though there are probably millions of people who have paperwork with official diagnoses of Asperger's disorder on their paperwork because it was a thing at one point. And this is whether something goes into the DSM is considered a disorder or not is controversial. It's political. It is. There are committees, and there are committees full of committees and committees who determine what goes in the DSM and exactly how whatever is in there is structured. Famously, homosexuality was at one point considered a disorder and put into the DSM and was taken out in the 1970s. Now we're dealing with, for example, I'm just trying to point out how murky all of this gets. Because primarily, if something is not listed in the DSM as a disorder, it is difficult to impossible to get medical treatment and or to get insurance to cover any medical procedures, any biological procedures. If your insurance pays for antidepressant medication, then you probably have an official diagnosis on your paperwork of depressive disorder. If depressive disorder, and there were no such thing as any of these depressive or mood disorders, if they were all just removed, the insurance companies would then say, well, there's no diagnosable problem here that we need to be taking care of, right? So then we get problems like what's going on with trans issues when it comes to the disorders, because unlike homosexuality, there are medical and biological treatments, procedures, interventions, whatever term you want to use, that we would theoretically want insurance to pay for. Certainly myself, as someone who considers themselves an ally to trans people and supportive of trans affirming care, I want insurance to cover trans affirming care, gender affirming care. In order for that to happen, it needs to stay in the DSM as a disorder. So there has to be some version of gender dysphoric disorder or whatever. So in the same place where people were campaigning to get homosexuality removed from the DSM, which again is something I 100% obviously support, in order to depathologize it, meaning we don't want it to seem like it's an injury or an illness. It's not a bad way to be. It's just a variation, like being taller or shorter or different hair color. It's just a variation. It's not better or worse. It's just a particular way that humans can be. So we wanted to remove it. Well, now a lot of the people who fought for that would fight to keep a very similar, at least, having some overlap disorders, keeping them in the DSM so that it's not turned into, well, this is just the way somebody is and doesn't need any support from the community or medical community or whatever. This stuff is murky. It's cultural. So officially, autism is autism spectrum disorder. Now, I utilize the neurodiversity paradigm. I look at the world through that lens. And as I've stated, I think most people still use what's called the medical model, which is everything we've been talking about. But the medical model states about a disorder that what we can call ordered behavior, ordered experiences, that stuff that's in the parameters of typical, we can call it healthy, we can call it appropriate, we can call it good, safe, whatever. All of those things, because it's good. That's the assumption in the medical model, is that that is good, and that any other version of being, any other pattern of experiences or behavior that exists outside of those parameters, we could say is unhealthy or bad or inappropriate or whatever. That's the medical model. That's what it means. Medical model is not talking about utilizing medical treatment. I am a proponent of neurodiversity. I take medication to treat my ADHD. There's nothing wrong with using medical intervention, biological intervention to support in these things. When we're talking about the medical model, we don't mean, it's not a debate of, is there a biological component to this? Can medical interventions be effective? We're not debating that. There are people who debate that, but that's not about talking about the medical model. The medical model, or again, sometimes called the deficit model, we're talking about a way of viewing this, which is to say that if you have a disorder that is bad, pathological, it is an injury or it is an illness, and the idea, the goal, the objective would be to heal that injury or that illness, to correct what is going, quote unquote, wrong in that model. Neurodiversity abolishes that. Neurodiversity is saying that we vary, that talking about differences in patterns of experiences and behavior is like talking about differences in, or variations in terms of appearance, that it is just an inevitable and natural form of variation. There's nothing pathological about it. That's the whole point. That doesn't mean that we don't think it's problematic in any sense. It doesn't mean that ADHD is a superpower and not a disability or any of that stuff. Because something not being pathological doesn't mean that it's not problematic. But it does mean that those problems are situational, not global. In other words, it is not always in any given context, no matter what you're trying to do, no matter what the circumstances are, it is not always beneficial to be taller than shorter. There are times when it's beneficial to be taller than shorter. There are times where it's beneficial to be shorter than taller. Even if you might make a claim, and some people I'm sure would, that on balance it's more one than the other, well, that has a lot to do with the culture, the society, the experiences that we're, in other words, something that's advantageous in our current school system is going to have a huge impact, because kids mostly engage with our current school system from age 5 to age 18. I mean, a lot. So if there's some variation which is natural in humanity and theoretically makes it so that all, or most, or on balance, the majority of the things that are asked of you in the academic environment are easier for you. It's an advantage in that way. That still doesn't mean that we would say that it's globally advantageous. That's a narrow set of experiences. It's a very narrow range of contexts and environments and whatever. So this is something that people generally, I think, have a intrinsic sense of. We each have our own strengths and weaknesses. Often people will talk about it. Even that, I don't like that language, because that's comparative. We don't need to say strength and weakness. It's just advantageous or disadvantageous. It's in terms of, this is why to me the accomplishment equation stuff that we talk about is so important. Because what we're talking about is things that make things less costly or more costly. Not more or less capable, but more or less costly. How much of your resources will it take? How much support might it take for a person to be able to accomplish a thing? not can they or can't they. Anyway, I'm doing this whole thing and there's still lots to get to and not a lot of time. So let me try and speed this up a little bit. The point is to say that we can say that autism is a disorder. If we are neurodiversity affirming, we can still say that autism is a disorder or that ADHD is a disorder, by which we mean that it is officially categorized as a disorder. Neurodiversity is not to say that some disorders should not be considered disorders because they're not pathological. Again, this is my version of it, but it's also kind of the origins of, it's the people who develop these concepts, their version of it too, and it's hard to defend other versions of this if you get this detail about it. Is that calling a thing a disorder has so many variables involved in calling it a disorder that it is not an inherent statement of goodness or badness. The medical model will say that it is, that it's pathological. Neurodiversity can say there's nothing wrong with admitting that a person is tall or that a person is short. Kind of like in the same way that autistic people kind of as a majority are opposed or tend to be opposed to person first language, right? Like a person with autism, because the premise of using person first language, that they are a person with autism, is to separate them from the autism, self-admittedly, right? That's the point. We say, no, they're not an autistic child. It's a child with autism because the autism doesn't define that. Well, that is premised on the idea that the autism is bad and that it is separate from whatever theoretically the core of the individual is. People who use identity first language say, I am an autistic person, are saying, A, it's a core part of who I am. If theoretically you were able to change me in such a way that I no longer was autistic, then I would also no longer be me. It is part of who I am. And B, that it's not a bad thing. Just like if a person says I'm tall or short or I have brown hair or blonde hair or whatever, it's an accurate label. It is not a denigration or an insult or an indication of some deficit. So that, I think, generally is where the pushback against involving the term disorder is, because it's still, the idea is most people have the idea that disorder and disease mean the same thing. The disorder inherently means pathological because that's how we treat it in our culture. It does not inherently mean that. And the reason I'm saying that even those people probably would agree with the technical identification of autism as a disorder is because if you didn't, then at most we're talking about it as culturally what we'd call like a personality trait, right? If you say I'm shy or I am, I don't even know what descriptors are there of people's personalities that we use all the time. I'm punctual, I'm dedicated, I am excitable, whatever. Like we have all these terms that we use to describe ourselves and each other in terms of some pattern of experiences and behaviors that we would not indicate, require, or even would benefit from some identification in a larger way, categorically, that we could say many people officially or unofficially fall under this category. Now, some people may be advocating that we eliminate autism disorder from the DSM. I'm not like up to speed on all the movements here. If they are, that it's not that I have an inherent problem with that. It's that if we eliminate it from the DSM, the way that things are structured is that we then eliminate the option for people to get official support, right? That if you're going to get accommodations at school, we have to have something to put on the paperwork. And would it be great if school and the workplace and medicine and health, the entire field and industry, if that was all structured differently so that it didn't need all this? Absolutely, 100%. But until and unless that happens, it is this way. And if we want people to be able to feel entitled and be entitled to support, then we have to have some way of categorizing it. So disorder is the best term we've got for that. This gets into all this kind of stuff of like why genetic research into autism is problematic at best. Because, well, it doesn't matter. It matters, just I haven't even gotten to like any of the stuff that we were supposed to be talking about today. This is part of why people struggle with using an actual neurodiversity affirming approach and tend more to just use neurodiversity language and apply it to a medical approach, is because neurodiversity is talking more from a language, linguistic perspective, at least, talking from that like I'm shy and I'm punctual and I'm dedicated kind of a thing. For example, self-identification. If you are not a supporter of self-identification, then you are holding to, at least in some ways, the medical model. And I'm not even talking about problems with equal access, well, unequal access to the channels required for official diagnosis, although that's a huge problem. There's also the arbitrary nature of the diagnostic process. The diagnostician has a lot of leeway, a lot of flexibility in what labels they apply. There's a reason that white boys are disproportionately diagnosed with ADHD and black boys are disproportionately diagnosed with oppositional and defiant disorder. Implicit biases play a role in it. So that in and of itself, even if everyone has access, that is still a problem. There's still the problem that this is all defined culturally. If everyone in a classroom is free to stand up and move around whenever they want, then when an individual is standing up and moving around frequently, we don't even identify that as a symptom, much less start a process of trying to allocate some diagnostic condition to explain the existence of that symptom. So all of that stuff means that if you are saying that only official diagnosis matters, only official diagnosis, therefore self-identification doesn't count, then that's medical model. It means there is an us and there's a them, and there's some definitive way. And it leads to a lot of what was being talked about in these questions, about people being hesitant about claiming a label, because it's arbitrary. And by arbitrary, I don't mean it doesn't make sense. Arbitrary, again, is a word with a specific meaning. It means as determined by some person, the arbiter, right? Like the person who is making the determination. It's inevitable. There's not a way around it with this kind of stuff. Linguistically, there's the old question of when does a pile become a pile? One piece of hay on the floor is not a pile, definitively. A million pieces of hay stacked together, lumped together, is a pile. Everyone would agree. What exactly is the turning point? Is 10 pieces of hay a pile or not? 50, 99, 100? At some point, you have to make a cutoff and say, yes, that's a pile, no, that's not a pile. And each individual person is going to use that cutoff wherever they feel it's usable. And that depends on the person. It depends on their history and their view and their biases. It also depends on the context. It depends on all kinds of things. So it's not to say that it's necessarily malicious, but that is how this is done, because there is no test. If we diagnose disorders the same way that we diagnose diseases, if we diagnose diseases, if medical treatment was done the same way that we diagnose and treat disorders, then you would show up to the doctor and say, oh, my stomach's really been hurting and I've been vomiting a lot and I can't keep anything down and I'm feeling really faint. And they would say, yep, okay, you have stomach hurting, feeling faint disorder, because the disorder is labeled based on what the symptoms are, not what the mechanism is that results in the symptoms. Because in a disorder, there is nothing but the symptom. There is no mechanism, or if there is, it's not one that we are able to observe, at least as of yet. There's lots of theories, but we don't say, sounds like you might have ADHD, let's check your blood and then definitively say yes or no. Sounds like you have ADHD, let's send you to a diagnostician who may run some tests, but those tests are not the same. It's not observable. And in the DSM, which is the only place that makes ADHD, remember, if we took it out of there, it would cease to be a thing officially. In the section where it describes ADHD, it explicitly says that tests like those administered in neuropsych evaluations, tests of working memory and attention, etc., while they may correlate with the condition, are not to be used as a diagnostic index. We are officially not allowed to use those tests, and yet everybody does anyway. So again, if you're talking about only official diagnosis matters, you're talking medical model. That's it, period. There's no other way around it. Now, whether or not, even if we're going with the neurodiversity model, if we're going away from the medical model, which obviously I support, that there's still reason that somebody might want to be specific and might want others to be specific and theoretically accurate about identifying in a particular way, ADHD or whatever. But again, that's cultural, meaning part of the relief, part of the benefit that one of these labels, these diagnostic labels, brings a person is before I get the label, I'm struggling, everyone's saying I should do this, and I'm not. By definition, I am not meeting cultural expectations. Of course, nobody is in sum total, but there's some specific version or pattern of cultural expectations that I'm supposed to be meeting and I'm not. And I'm being told over and over, because it's the cultural expectation, that I should be, and most people seem to be because it's the expectation, and I am not, and I feel terrible, and I'm trying to do stuff and everyone's mad at me and blah, blah, blah. It's an awful experience. And then I get a diagnosis, and then I say, oh, okay, it's not that I'm bad or lazy or wrong or broken. It's just that I have a disorder. It's not a thing that I'm doing wrong. It's just a disorder. That brings relief for people, which is one of the values of having these labels. And then if somebody like that, who's experienced relief from getting a disorder, a diagnosis in that way, observes other people also taking on that label, but having different experiences than theirs, then that muddies the water, and it messes it up a bit. And if something I have struggled with repeatedly and it's caused me a lot of problem and is officially now allocated as part of my ADHD or a symptom of my ADHD, and then I see somebody else who's not struggling with that thing and they claim to be ADHD as well, then of course there's going to be a natural, like, no, that's not what you're talking about, is not ADHD, because I have ADHD and it means that I struggle with this thing. You're not struggling with that thing, so you can't have ADHD, which is fine. It's valid to feel that way. It's even valid to have those conversations, because that's what language is. We debate, we have our own perspectives over what words mean what things. Everybody has their own connotations and denotations and experience, and context matters. It is totally fine. And if you do anything, if you put effort, time, energy, any resources toward trying to take away something from somebody else that is helpful to them, it's fine to feel that way, to say to yourself, no, they've got it wrong, because that preserves that benefit for you, and saying, yeah, okay, they're saying that, but they mean a different thing or whatever. But to then go to somebody who's found a term that they find useful and say, you can't use that term because that's my term, it's not yours. That's entering different territory. And when we're talking about disorder, to me, it's hard to justify spending resources in that way. There are other better things to be doing with our time and energy. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not worth having a conversation, especially on the kind of cultural level, the community level, about what language broadly do we want to use. Again, that's fine. That should happen. We do need to talk with one another, because that's what language is. It's a set of symbols with a mutually agreed upon, a mutually established meaning behind them, even though that meaning will vary from person to person. That's all great. But not if we're approaching it from the idea that some people are right and some people are wrong, or some people are good and some people are bad. So to make the point that we don't want to use disorder here, we don't want to have that associated with autism, because the general conceptualization of disorder is one of pathology, I think that's a very valid point, and maybe that's the way to go. To say that someone is wrong for using the term disorder would be a different thing, because they're technically not, but it wouldn't matter if they are or if they aren't. It's an optics debate, it's a messaging, it's a language debate, and it's an important and a valid one. And we didn't even get into all this stuff, so maybe we'll do some more next week when Marie's back. Actually, we're going to also have Caitlin Miller, one of our clinicians, is going to start joining us. I'm very excited about that. And maybe we can talk then more about ADHD and autism and the overlap or not overlap, or all this stuff. I have thoughts and theories, and it's worth talking about for sure. But just know that when we're talking about this stuff, especially if we're talking about it through the lens of neurodiversity, we are talking about something which is not observably, factually correct or incorrect. It's about people's experiences. I don't know what your internal experience is. The only way I have of knowing anything about that is your attempt to communicate to me about it. And the same is true in return. You know nothing about my internal experience except for the ways in which I communicate with you about it. And our ability to communicate with one another is imperfect at best. We are not able to get things across with 100% veracity. You won't understand exactly down to the last minute particular detail and connotation. You won't know exactly what I mean. I won't know exactly what you mean. For communication, we're just trying to get close enough that we can get on with whatever we're trying to get on with. This is in existential philosophy and existential therapy. one of the four universal fears of isolation, which actually, ooh, by the way, really interesting research, and research is, specious, especially fMRI research, which this is. But it was an interesting study that came out just recently, talking about the fact that lonely people perceive the world, view the world differently from people who don't identify as lonely, but also from other people who identify as lonely. Whereas people who identify as not being lonely tend to identify the world using the same cognitive processes as one another, which is, to me, very, very relevant to this conversation we're having. And yes, I am cherry picking, because other fMRI studies, I would say, no, but this one backs up some things that I already think, so I'm jumping on it. But at the end of the day, if someone's identifying as neurodivergent, whether you've been officially diagnosed and accept and embrace that terminology and label, or whether you identify that way yourself, either way, inherent, and the only thing that is inherent in that experience is for someone to say, I feel as though I am different than most people in some impactful, significant way. Anyway, that's existential isolation, is the idea that no one can know maybe I'm freaking people out because it is an existential fear. So I'm sorry if I'm doing that, especially as I got to get going here in a minute. I didn't think it through all that way, but we can't get things across 100%. We just have to take it on faith with each other. We just have to act in our best interest. Now, other people can observe my behavior, regardless of my ability to communicate it to them. And certainly other people can observe the impact I have, right? So for example, you might say that I have caused harm. And you may be correct and I might be incorrect if I say I didn't. Now, if I say I didn't mean to, and you say that I did, then I am correct and you are incorrect, because I know what's inside myself, you don't. Do people lie about that? Sure, we lie about things all the time, yes. But how are you gonna, you're gonna just say that if someone says something differently than you think about their own internal experience, they must be lying? Because again, that's a slippery slope, right? Now, if I don't intend to cause harm and I do, and someone observes the impact of my behavior, that it caused harm that I might not even be aware of, then we don't need to sit here and argue about whether I did or I didn't. If I did, I did. And for those of us who are really trying to embrace this, I welcome that information. I want to know when I do that, because I don't intend to do that. I try my best to be helpful and to avoid being harmful. But it's impossible to never cause any harm unintentionally. I can't know everything. I can't predict everything. Millions of people could listen to me talk, and someone could literally hear my words and think I said different words than I said, much less interpret them in a different way than I intended. We have different content. I'm going to cause harm, and I hate it, but I'm putting myself out there to try this stuff anyway, because the only way to 100% guarantee that you never harm anybody is to never interact with anybody. But you can also 100% guarantee that you're not helping anyone that way either. I don't know. We engage in this stuff. Let's talk about it. Let's debate about it. Let's just do it in good faith, as opposed to approaching this as some of us are wrong and some of us are right. We are all doing our best to try and figure this out. And whether you follow the medical model or the neurodiversity model or whatever, social model, all this stuff, it doesn't matter. We're all trying to figure it out. Even if you think everything that we're talking about is 100% organic and biological in nature and no other variables matter, which is, to me, absurd and indefensible, because behavior is multivariate, language, there is no. But even if you think that, well, a new piece of research comes out and says to you, oh, turns out this thing that we thought was X is actually Y, and you're going to then shift your opinion, because we are all just trying to figure this out. Experience and behavior is far too complex to be able to reduce down to simple cause and effect. It is impossible to do that. So we're just figuring this out. And the more that we communicate with one another, the more that we collaborate with one another, the more that we're open to other people's ideas and ways of thinking about things, the more that we're going to do in terms of learning and forwarding our own understanding, our awareness of ourselves and of each other, our ability to form community and assist one another. Everything gets better the more we communicate. It's imperfect, and we're going to make mistakes, and we miscommunicate, and we cause harm. But the only other option is to not communicate. We communicate, we listen when people give us feedback, Even if I use a word that I think means this thing, but you interpret it that way, which is technically by the dictionary incorrect, if you tell me that, great. I still want to know. It doesn't matter what's in the dictionary. Who cares? If using that word causes harm to at least one person, and if it does to one, it's probably going to do it to more. I want to know about that. Maybe that means we talk about it and have a discussion about what word I'm using and how I conceptualize it and what you're thinking, or maybe we work together to come up with something new or whatever. But I'd much rather know than have somebody just sit on it because they're not sure whether they're using the term correctly. And this is where a lot of this online stuff with AuDHD and all this stuff gets murky, is because we are starting to have these conversations together culturally, largely because of social media and sped up over the last few years by the pandemic, and people are getting involved more and more in these communities, but it started long before all that. That prior to this was relegated to academic and medical circles. These are conversations that small groups of people have been having for a long time, and now we're all getting involved on it, which is great. But it's tricky if we're still trying to use all the, say the small groups of people that have been having the conversation are definitively correct, then we're just calling each other out and trying to say yes and no to each other, as opposed to let's work on this together. That anybody who is a neurodiversity advocate, hell, anyone online who is an autistic advocate, especially autistic self-advocacy, you have to be having a lot of experience of people trying to come at you and tell you that the language you're using is incorrect, that what you are experiencing is not autism because of X, Y, and Z and blah, blah, blah. We don't want to turn around and do that same thing. So should we use the term? I don't typically use the term disorder. I say autistic. I use identity first language unless somebody explicitly tells me that they're more comfortable with person first language, in which case I switch, because I try to use the language that people tell me that makes them most comfortable. But I default to identity first language, and I don't use the term disorder. So I see a lot of merit in that. But I guess, some of this is hindered by me not being involved in these conversations. I don't spend a lot of time on social media. It's kind of a trap for me in particular. I get stuck on things and looping on things. And Marie's not here, and maybe she could help shed some more light. I'm just saying, if the conversation is about that it is incorrect, then that's a different conversation. But yeah, maybe next week when it's not just me, I won't get stuck on the same thing. To me, by the way, I'll just say as a bit of a glimpse, I do identify using both of those terms. I don't typically use those terms, partly because of the same hesitations people were talking about. I don't use those terms a lot to refer to myself, and I'm careful about it because I don't want to take something that, like we talked about, somebody's found relief in identifying as having ADHD or being autistic, and then I say it and they think I'm different from them in some way, and now they feel like, oh, well, then I do feel worse about myself or whatever. I don't want to risk that. I do think, to the best of my knowledge, those terms are accurate terms for me. I have a lot of reasoning for that. And my experience this past hour of sitting here and talking to you one-on-one, I'm looking at a video of myself talking to nobody, and nobody's saying anything in chat, but I get caught up and carried away on all these things. And I would say it's probably unusual, to the best of my ability to understand. This is an unusual thing to find joy in sitting here and talking about. I mean, to me, this is me hyper-focusing, which is an ADHD thing, on my special interest, which is an autism thing. And hey, those two things seem to overlap a lot, right? Like hyper-focusing on something and something being your special interest. They're not exactly the same, but sometimes some things both terms could apply to, some couldn't, but even the ones that couldn't, there's a lot of overlap, right? Same with stimming and fidgeting. I have a lot of thinking, a lot of ideas around this. And I want to make it clear that my thinking isn't any more valid than anybody else's. It's just me putting my thoughts and ideas out there, and others put theirs out there, and we can kind of work together to come to some mutual understanding of what kind of language seems to be most useful and et cetera. But generally, make it a bigger tent rather than a smaller one is always a good piece of advice. Good to be with y'all. I'm sorry I didn't get to any practical things, but if nothing else, I hope people walk away from this with disorder, disease, and syndrome is kind of separated out. If I'm wrong about anything there or anywhere else, please let me know. It's not like I've put hours of research into this. It's just to the best of my knowledge, and I've put some work in. Put in enough work to feel confident with saying what I'm saying, but I'm wrong all the time, and I would love it if I am wrong, that someone would correct me. I would appreciate that. I gotta go. Good to be with y'all. I'll see you next week. Bye.